Hello, and welcome to PPMD's 26th annual conference, and the first conference we're offering completely virtual. I'm Ryan Fisher, Senior Vice President of Community Engagement for PPMD. I'm joined today by my colleague, Eric Camino. He's Director of Research and Clinical Innovation. We're going to be joined in a minute by PPMD's President, Pat Furlong. Pat's joining us remotely from her home office in Ohio because of travel complications, but rest assured, she's going to be here throughout the conference, so that's the good news. She's actually going to welcome everybody with an opening message in just a minute. So I understand, as we understand, that it was hard that we couldn't do conference in person this year. I think everyone loves the opportunity to connect with one another, see old friends, and meet new ones. But while the pandemic has delayed the opportunity to see each other in person for this year, we know we will see each other again. And we have a really, really exciting 4 days ahead of us. Lots of opportunities for you to connect virtually with one another. We also know the pandemic's not going to stop us and our momentum in this community to advance drug development and improve the lives of everybody with Duchenne. So we have a packed agenda, lots in store. What do we have in store?
So we have a really full agenda over these next 4 days. So over the 4 days, you are going to hear from a number of expert clinicians who are going to talk to you about areas of care for Duchenne, Becker, and carriers. They're going to be joined by members of our PPMD care team, a number of parents and caregivers, as well as some individuals with Duchenne. In addition to those care sessions, we have an In the Pipeline series, and that is really exploring the investigational products that are being developed to treat Duchenne. So you're going to hear from sponsors, you're going to learn about their clinical trials and what is on the horizon. In addition to all of that wonderful content, we're going to have some opportunities for families to meet one-on-one with physical therapists and genetic counselors. We have a great poster session that is up on the Hub website. So if you go there, you can go see some more information about research and clinical trials and connect with those presenters. And then, of course, as Ryan mentioned, we recognize that part of what we love about conference is the ability for you to connect with the community, to see old friends and make new connections. And so we have a number of Zoom social events planned for the evenings after we wrap from conference. That way we can continue to build those bonds in our community. So I'm going to hand it back to Ryan to talk about a little housekeeping we have for the conference.
Thanks, Eric. So, just some housekeeping. Bookmark the conference hub on your computer. This is going to be your go-to place for everything related to conference. You'll be able to see pre-recorded videos from our industry sponsors and researchers that you can watch at your leisure. You're going to be able to schedule all those appointments, those one-on-one appointments that Eric was talking about with physical therapists and behavior specialists. You'll also be able to register for our Lunch and Learn series. So make this your go-to place, put it on your web browser, and be sure to visit us every day. You're going to get an email every morning as well. It's going to remind you of what's ahead for the rest of the day. And we're grateful that you're joining us remotely. So, throughout the conference, you're going to be able to submit questions. You'll do this through the question box below your video player. You could do that at any time. We're not going to be able to answer every question, of course, but we will follow up with you if your question was not answered during the time of the virtual conference. And if you have any problems, you can email comments@parentprojectmd.org so we can help you with any tech issues or any questions you may have. Okay, so coming up today, we have a great night ahead of us. We have a panel on COVID-19 and re-entry. We totally understand that this is a topic that is on everyone's minds, and we're going to address this with a great panel of speakers. We have our first in our series called In the Pipeline. Here, you're going to hear from companies that are focused on developing therapies aimed at reducing inflammation. And finally, we have some fun stuff, a pop quiz and some polling that you'll be able to take part in, and then a special performance later on tonight. So with that, we're actually going to kick this to Pat Furlong, who's going to open the conference with an update of what's happened since our last conference. Pat?
Thank you, Ryan and Eric. I'm so sorry that I can't be in the studio with you today. It's really hard to believe that just 13 months ago, many of us were gathered in Orlando for our 25th anniversary conference. It was an incredible meeting and a wonderful celebration of this community, a community that has supported me and my family during our hardest days and understands this journey in a way that no one else can. If I was giving you the state of Duchenne landscape 25 years ago, it would be quick. There was little to no investment in research. Standards of care were painfully absent, and our community had no voice and no champions in Washington. Today, the progress we've made as a community is jaw-dropping, including in the last year alone. So before we spend the next 4 days looking ahead at what is on the Duchenne landscape, let's recap these last 12 months, including the impact of a global pandemic and our community's response. First up, under research. We're so proud of our ongoing investment in all stages of Duchenne research. We continue to take an innovative approach to research. And because of your generosity and support of our mission to end Duchenne, we are able to ensure the clinical trial pipeline is full of promise. PPMD announced that as part of our ongoing cardiac research initiative, we committed to funding $1 million to Dr. H. Lee Sweeney and his team at the University of Florida in Gainesville. This is to continue their exploration of developing novel therapies to include gene therapies that can directly address the cause of dilated heart failure in both Duchenne and Becker muscular dystrophy. PPMD awarded a $465,000 grant to Renzi Han of the Ohio State University College of Medicine. This is to study the potential use of an in vivo-based gene editing approach to restore full-length dystrophin protein in the heart, as well as skeletal muscle. We awarded grants to Dr. Kan Hor from Nationwide Children's Hospital and Dr. Danshen Duong from the University of Missouri. This is to further development of their research into potential therapies that would improve cardiac health in people living with Duchenne. All of this work is part of PPMD's cardiac initiative. The Duchenne Registry app launched, making it easier than ever to keep your registry profile updated. We hosted a community meeting, live streamed, so families could provide input into the protocol design for the Duchenne platform trial, with the aim to increase access to therapeutic trials for all individuals across the Duchenne community. PPMD shared clinical trial harmonization guidelines. These guidances are the result of our drug development roundtable, which spent the last 2 years developing a tool that would help provide more consistency across companies who are planning clinical trials in Duchenne. PPMD announced a new interactive drug development pipeline to help you stay up to date on all therapies that are currently in development. Under advocacy, we continue to pursue our ambitious advocacy agenda. The week before the world shut down, over 100 families gathered in Washington, D.C. for PPMD's annual advocacy conference. Our request included $10 million for peer-reviewed Duchenne research through the Department of Defense and a $6 million grant to the CDC for their muscular dystrophy program. That week, before our world so dramatically changed, over 100 families gathered in Washington, D.C. for PPMD's annual advocacy conference, sharing our stories, raising our voices to ensure Duchenne research and care continue to receive federal funding. We were the last organization in the U.S. to host an advocacy event on Capitol Hill this year, and while we worried about the risk, no one who attended that meeting became sick, and our very presence has resulted in tremendous support from Congress for Duchenne-related programs and funding. We're awaiting Congress to finish next year's budget, and we'll keep everyone updated on our progress. Next, care. Care remains the foundation of PPMD's mission. Since last summer's annual conference, PPMD certified 2 more clinics under our Certified Duchenne Care Program, including our first adult center, and we've guided the certification of our international clinic in the Czech Republic with the World Duchenne Organization. We hosted our 3rd annual Duchenne Healthcare Professional Summit, which included more than 250 healthcare professionals. We announced that our support and care materials, including critical emergency information, are now available in both English and Spanish. As always, these resources are provided at no cost to the community. And we shared a Meet the Experts series, a monthly webinar series dedicated to care updates focused on every system of the human body that's impacted by Duchenne. Bringing families together is at the core of our DNA at PPMD. We want to connect families and people with Duchenne so that no one feels alone on this journey. To that end, PPMD's Adult Advisory Committee launched a Facebook page so that teens and young adults with Duchenne can stay connected and hang out virtually. Our PPMD Connect groups continue to grow with 28 local groups today, run by volunteer Duchenne parents, grandparents, and people with Duchenne, serving many functions, but primarily existing as a source of information, support, and comfort for all our families in our community. We continue to have teams running around the country raising money for PPMD as part of the Race to End Duchenne program. Grassroots events have exploded with families getting creative in their fundraising efforts, hosting reading events, silent auctions, local runs, 0.1Ks, online fundraisers, and of course our annual Coach to Cure event. And then the pandemic hit. We were all so stunned when life as we knew it, when the entire world came to a screeching halt in mid-March. But we don't have time to stop for a virus. The fight to end Duchenne is already a battle against the clock. Plus, with so much momentum in our clinical trial pipeline and early stage research and care, we had to make sure our progress continued and nothing was put on pause any longer than necessary. So with that, our work continued, and maintaining our research pursuits are critical. PPMD and our friends at Duchenne UK launched a joint 2020 research grant call in early June, inviting research proposals for submission and review. Up to $1 million is committed to a project or projects seeking to minimize the immunological issues of gene therapy to treat Duchenne. We introduced virtual office hours with our genetic counselors as part of PPMD's Duchenne registry. Scheduling a one-on-one appointment with a genetic counselor has never been easier. We revamped our updates on Duchenne clinical trials, approved drugs website to keep families updated on the latest in clinical trials in light of the pandemic as companies shared their clinical trial updates. Hundreds of families participated in PPMD's COVID-19 survey to gain insight directly from the Duchenne and Becker community on the impact of the pandemic as it relates to care, clinical trials, access to FDA-approved therapies. We continue to compile the data, which will be vital to informing the work of relevant stakeholder groups, including physicians, drug developers, and patient advocacy groups. While navigating COVID-19 was and continues to be complicated, especially for our community, PPMD's care team hit the ground running when that pandemic hit. PPMD is proud to be the first Duchenne organization to launch a COVID-19 coronavirus information center to help families stay on top of the latest information regarding COVID-19 and precautions you should take if you have Duchenne. Information and updates came quickly, especially in the early days of the pandemic as we all started sheltering in place. PPMD updated our COVID-19 Information Center and will continue to, reflecting the latest information from the CDC, our network of healthcare providers, and our industry partners. This included widely disseminated COVID-19 and Duchenne care initiatives. PPMD unveiled a variety of new care materials, including a new animated video to help kids understand Duchenne, a newly diagnosed guide, care checklists based on age, a physical therapy video library, an accompanied range of motion handout, as well as our 3-volume Education Matters guide to help families and teachers navigate Duchenne at school when everyone is able to head back, either in person, virtually, or a hybrid of both, come this fall. PPMD hosted weekly informational webinars for the community on topics families are facing, including the do's and don'ts of telehealth visits, accessing approved therapies, and navigating home care during this time. All of these webinars are available to watch and shared on our website. Family Fridays started the first week of quarantine and continue today, providing you with Facebook Live conversations about the topics you're most worried about during this time. We've covered homeschooling during a pandemic, managing sibling relationships, navigating your neuromuscular team, easy at-home activities you can do with the whole family, and coping with the stress and anxiety. As important topics emerge, we will continue to program these informal conversations to stay connected and well-informed. We continue to certify Duchenne care centers, including our first dual certification, adult and pediatric, with 2 additional pediatric centers, 29 in all CDCCs. The Certification Steering Committee continues to review clinics interested in certification, managing certifications remotely until the world reopens. Muscle and Nerve published an article summarizing the contractures in Duchenne and other neuromuscular conditions. This was a conference hosted by PPMD with the NIH and National Institutes of Neurology, Disorders, and Stroke, NIAMS, and National Health and Child Development, and the Shirley Ryan Ability Lab. We're so proud to have led this publication of this important information on contractures. Dr. Claudia Senesac from the University of Florida, Gainesville was named our 2020 Change a Champion. This is for her dedication to the Duchenne community based on her work teaching families physical therapy, teaching students, and her involvement in creating the most ambitious Duchenne-specific physical therapy library that exists in the world today. Our voice, our message in Washington, D.C. has remained constant, loud, and steady during this time. As a result of 123 meetings with members of Congress in Washington, D.C., and over 2,500 action alert emails sent by this community, we're pleased to report a very successful outcome to the Duchenne fiscal year 2021 funding letters and signatures. We joined over 400 patient organizations in a letter led by the American Association of People with Disabilities, urging the Department of Health and Human Services to issue further guidance addressing the application of federal non-discrimination laws around their plans to ration scarce health care resources during the COVID pandemic. We continue to update the community on assistance programs for Duchenne families affected financially by COVID-19, including government programs and aid offered by other advocacy organizations. And just because life has become about Zoom calls and baking banana bread at home, we found ways to keep the community engaged, including having a little fun at times. In May, we celebrated a class of 2020 with a virtual graduation party, including special guests. PPMD's Adult Advisory Committee started hosting bi-weekly social gatherings on Zoom. We hosted welcome sessions for newly diagnosed families ahead of this year's virtual conference so that they could head into this week's meeting with a basic understanding of Duchenne, as well as a connection to other families in our community. We're helping you stay active with virtual exercise events for the whole family, including the Duchenne Daily 20, early in spring, in our Race to End Duchenne virtual fitness and fundraising challenge that's going on right now. And with so many events and races having to be canceled because of COVID-19, PPMD is brainstorming new and exciting ways to raise funds and awareness to fight to end Duchenne. Stay tuned for more. One of the toughest decisions we've had to make is our now 26-year history as an organization was canceling PPMD's annual conference. But like so many things right now, it was just too risky to bring our community together in person to connect. Your health and safety has always been our number one priority. Like I said before, we won't be stopped by a virus, by social distancing, or by quarantining. And with all that continues to move forward in Duchenne research and care and advocacy, there was no way we would let this summer go by without gathering, at least virtually. The next several days are going to provide you with the same wealth of information you've come to expect with our annual conference. You'll be able to schedule one-on-one sessions with physical therapists, school experts, and genetic counselors. You'll also have the opportunity to make new friends, reunite with families you haven't seen in a while, and spend some much-needed downtime with this extraordinary community. We all struggle to keep hope in our hearts after our families receive a diagnosis of Duchenne, but that's what this community is for, and that's what PPMD is for, to help hold each other up, to keep believing in the possibility of treatments for everyone affected by Duchenne. And we recognize we won't do any of this alone. We're all grateful to every Duchenne organization, foundation, and family working every single day to end Duchenne. Together, we keep hope alive. Together, we will end Duchenne. Thank you for joining us, and welcome to PPMD's 2020 virtual annual conference.
Thank you so much, Pat. That was wonderful. We now are ready to go to our first session of the conference. And I think understandably, we're going to talk about COVID-19. This has been the national conversation, the global conversation for so many of us for so many months. We felt it extremely appropriate to start with this topic, as so many are grappling with decision-making around COVID-19 when it comes to re-entry into society. And I think for our community, it may mean something a little different than others. And like many rare disease communities, we're having to think through what makes the most sense for our families when it comes to things like school, going back to your care appointments, and then even clinical trials. So with that, we're going to talk about these topics. We have a wonderful panel joining us remotely today. Leading the panel with myself will be Pat Furlong, PPMD's president. On the panel, we have PPMD board member and school teacher, which is quite appropriate for this conversation, Joanna Johnson. We have Dr. Joanne M. Donovan. She's with Catabasis Pharmaceuticals, so she's going to give us the industry perspective on what's happening and the impact of COVID on trials. And then from the clinical perspective, we have Dr. Oren Kupfer from Children's Hospital of Colorado and Dr. Jeffrey Oletta from Nationwide Children's Hospital, who's an infectious disease specialist. And actually, Dr. Oletta is going to start us off with sort of a level set of where we are right now with COVID-19. Dr. Oletta?
Great, thank you very much. It's an honor to be here and really a pleasure. So let's start with the first slide. So I have some background material on COVID. I think the top three websites that I want everybody to be familiar with are the WHO, the World Health Organization, the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and in this case, I have Ohio, which is my state Department of Health. We want to think globally, we want to think nationally, and we want to think locally when it comes to COVID. On that CDC website are some guidelines, in particular the school guidelines that everyone has often heard on the news. So that's a nice reference in order to take a look. Next slide, please. So with regards to SARS-CoV-2, that's the virus that causes COVID-19, so coronavirus disease 19. So with regards to this virus, it is clearly in the driver's seat. It's easily transmissible. It's a hardy virus that can remain on surfaces, and what we now have learned is aerosolized. It has very little in terms of weaponry against it. So there's not many antiviral medications that eradicate it. There are some antiviral medications that suppress it, but none that completely eradicate it. And certainly we do not have an immune response against the virus. And therefore, there is no vaccine in order to contain the virus. So on the other side of the graph, on the right side, is what we've been living in clearly in the United States and in the last several months. And right now, they're actually seeing this in Houston and in Phoenix and in Los Angeles. And that is, we are exceeding our healthcare capacity because some of us just don't do three simple things. We don't wear a mask. We don't stay at home if we're sick or if we're exposed. We don't social distance, and we certainly don't wash our hands off. And if this country just did those three things, we can certainly contain the virus. Now, we couldn't eradicate it, but we certainly could contain it. Next slide. So some of the hot topics that the group has come up with are what happens in children who get COVID. So we'll talk a little bit about that. When is a vaccine coming? So there's actually been a news release on vaccines. Return to school, is it even possible? So we'll talk a little bit about that. And what is the with regards to a virus that away in, please. So with regards to, next slide. So with regards to kids and COVID, in general, COVID-19 remains an adult disease, especially with regards to disease severity. So there seems to be a veil of protection that kids have, even immunocompromised kids. So I'm also a bone marrow transplant physician, and actually we have seen very little of COVID in our bone marrow transplant patients. In addition, very little in terms of bone marrow transplant patients even having the virus. In other words, being screened when they're asymptomatic. As a whole, the hospital has seen very little pediatric patients with COVID-19. So again, COVID-19 remains an adult disease. That certainly doesn't mean that immunocompromised kids have a free ticket from it. It just means that as it stands statistically, COVID-19 remains an adult disease. So that really should provide some reassurance to people on the panel right now and listening. And that is, if we do those three simple things, it's very unlikely that kids will actually have severe disease and actually need to be hospitalized. That's been our local experience and actually been the national and even international experience. In addition to that, there is this disease entity called multi-system inflammatory syndrome in children. That's very rare. It's serious, but it's very rare. We're talking like less than 2% of kids actually get that. So again, message here is COVID is an adult disease. However, we have to have our antenna up. We have to follow social distancing, wash our hands, wear a mask. But as it stands right now, COVID-19 is definitely an adult disease in terms of numbers. Next slide. So vaccines, when are they coming? So there's been 4 drug companies actually who have vaccines available in early phase trials. So for the most part, in general, some of these vaccines are immunogenic, which means that they produce an immune response against SARS-CoV-2 in the body, and they're safe so far. Now, again, this is in hundreds of people. We need to look in thousands of people. And that's called a phase 3 trial. And that's how we're able to say if we can actually see which of these viruses has the best response against the virus, a protective response, and is the safest in order to give to people. The other thing becomes manufacture to scale, right? You can't have one drug company make 1 billion vaccines. Economically, that's difficult to do, in addition to distributing that. So there are going to be several companies who have several different types of vaccines, which is actually okay, as long as they're safe, as long as they're effective. What we want to do is instill herd immunity. In other words, have the vast majority of us have an immune response against the virus so we don't get sick and we don't spread it. Next slide, please. So right now, the issue becomes school, right? That's a big issue amongst all of us. And the question becomes, how do we do that? So the American Academy of Pediatrics says, definitely go to school. Well, the definite part is difficult to actually do on a practical level. Next slide, please. So this slide actually probably sums it all up, and that is one size doesn't fit all. So as we know in the country, there are different prevalence and incidence of the virus. In some states, the virus is actually at very high levels. I mentioned Texas and Arizona and California. In other states, it's not so high. So one can actually say, think about rather that in those states that have a lower prevalence of virus, it actually might be okay to go to school. It's probably not okay to go to school in a high prevalent area. In addition to that, you have to look at the school and policies and what they have available with regards to social distancing and what they have available in terms of classroom size. It's very difficult in the inner city to actually go to school when they have close quarters and when they don't have gymnasiums or other facilities in order to allow space or social distancing to occur. Those are difficult places to actually have to go back to school in. So there's always going to be a risk. There's never going to be anyone on this panel that can say to you, the risk is 0 to go back to school. Nor is there going to be anyone on this panel that says, you know what, don't worry about it, go back to school. I think we all know that there are risks to going back to school. We all know, however, there are benefits to going back to school. PT, OT, socialization, friends, all those things are so very important. And again, if you live in the inner city, it's a meal. I mean, that's how important school is for you. So it also gives with regards to testing capacity. So again, this gets into prevalence of disease in your community and the ability to contain it. Next slide, please. So again, on the CDC, there are considerations for schools. It's something that's readily available, and it's actually a pretty good reference. Next slide, please. In addition to that, there are state guidelines. So this was from the Ohio Department of Education, which I thought was actually pretty good, that ran through checklists of things that should be identified and addressed in schools. Next slide, please. And lastly, there are other organizations, much like PPMD. There are other family engagement centers that have very worthwhile information as well. Next slide. So in the end, we all have to ride out the waves of COVID-19. This virus is not going anywhere anytime soon. It's going to be with us for literally years. That's how long it's going to take in order to develop herd immunity. I often give the example, it's certainly not clinically like influenza, but it's often going to be like influenza in terms of vaccinations. So we have to figure out a way to contain the virus, a way to live with the virus, and to live with it safely. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Oletta. That was really, really helpful to set the stage for this discussion. So, Joanna Johnson, I'm actually going to start with you as a parent of two children with Duchenne, but also a teacher. I'm wondering how you're thinking through this for yourself and also your own students, if you can comment on that.
It's been on my mind constantly, pretty much, as I guess most teachers throughout the country can say. And, you know, obviously all of us parents with kids with Duchenne. I think and I think Jeff said it really well. I think the most important thing that we need to do is be informed. And that means being, you know, knowing what your school, if anything, if they're offering any kind of a plan or options for plans. Or a lot of schools, my particular school district where I teach is still, the school board is still voting on different options. So I think having as most information that you can as possible to make an informed decision is critical. The other thing that I would, as a parent of kids with Duchenne, I think you should be in contact with your school's principal to get, for one thing, just to say that you're concerned. Also, it's a good idea for most of our sons have IEPs to get in touch with their special ed teacher or their coordinator and talk about any particular situations that you're concerned about or what going back to school would look like. Or if you're approaching it as you would prefer to do more of an online situation, you know, let them know that that's something that you're interested in, and just start having the discussions as soon as possible. I think a lot of us in this community are pretty used to being the squeaky wheel, and I think now it's time to be that squeaky wheel and make sure that you know you let your district know your concerns, any kind of forums that you can participate in. I know there's a lot that's going on in the district where I teach that they're allowing, and I've been involved on every single one. So I would say just, and the situation is going to be different for every parent. I think I wish, you know, I mean, Jeff said it well. I wish there was one answer, you know, oh, we're all going to be fine, or no, nobody should go to school. I think it really comes down to an individual decision for families, and you know, like we always do, measuring out benefit versus risk.
Yeah, that's very, very true. You know, and I think that, you know, each parent's going to have conversations with their school, their clinician, to think through what's best for their own situation. Dr. Kupfer, you know, you're in Colorado. I believe you have children of your own as well, and you care for patients with Duchenne muscular dystrophy across the spectrum of disease. And you're having conversations with those who may have more pulmonary complications than others. Are your conversations different depending upon the patient? And can you talk a little bit about what you're advising about this big question of school?
So I'm a pulmonologist. I take care of kids through adulthood with muscular dystrophy. I have young men in their 30s in my care, despite being a pediatric pulmonologist. So I see the full spectrum of respiratory disorders in Duchenne. I've been talking to my patients on a very practical level. We have relatively low prevalence of COVID-19 in Colorado. We saw a peak in April and May, and we've had a drop off and then a recent slow rise again in cases. But compared to places with high prevalence like New York and New Jersey early on, and now Texas, California, Arizona, Florida, we are still at relatively low prevalence. So that's kind of coloring the discussion that I have with my patients. I think it would be very different if I was in a high prevalence kind of area. So really what I'm talking about is disease prevention. So social distancing, hand washing, wearing a mask if you can, and then limiting exposure. I think, as Dr. Auletta said very well, and Joanna added very nicely, the discussion about returning to school is not just about viral transmission. It's also about what else does your child need. And I think that's extremely important. I've struggled with my own 3 kids in terms of when to send them back to school, if at all, and our friends in our own neighborhood are making wildly different decisions based on the same information that we're hearing. I think one of the key points is to remember that we don't actually know, and this is hard for a physician to say, by the way, we don't actually know what's going to happen. We don't know everything about this virus. We don't know what the long-term impacts are, even of a mild infection. And so any decision that you make as a family is reasonable, as long as you're also not making decisions that harm others. And that's where wearing a mask, social distancing, and washing your hands is extremely important. To answer a question that's probably circulating out there, have we seen any patients with Duchenne with COVID? And my answer in my 300 plus patients is no. That doesn't mean it hasn't happened, but we haven't detected anybody with COVID. They haven't been sick. Now, there's some rate of asymptomatic infection where you have COVID-19, but you don't have any symptoms. And so we may have missed a few people here and there, but we have not seen patients get sick with it. And remember, this is up to and including all those young adults and adult young men who may have it. So I've had occasion to test numerous patients, and none of them have had it. That doesn't mean we can't get it. It just means that it hasn't happened. And perhaps that's a good sign, but I won't put too much weight on it.
Great. Thank you for that. I know that families have brought up, and this is a question for you, Dr. Kupfer, and perhaps Dr. Auletta. Families have brought up about a recent study in regards to steroids offering some sort of protection against complications with COVID. And with our population utilizing steroids, some are wondering, is this going to provide that protection already? And what does it mean if there's some has been on steroids for many years in terms of COVID? Perhaps Dr. Kupfer and then Dr. Auletta could comment on this.
Go ahead, Jeff. I see you unmuted yourself.
Oh, Oren, if you. So actually, I think there are 2 important things about SARS-CoV-2, and that is the virus and then the body's response to the virus. The virus obviously is infected, goes into the nose and down into the breathing tube and into the lower lungs, and then causes an inflammatory response. So that has to do with kind of the body's response to the virus. So it's interesting that you bring up the steroids because of a couple of things. Number one, we actually use steroids in patients who actually have the disease and have a pretty severe form of it, either on a respiratory machine or on supplemental oxygen, in combination with remdesivir, which is an antiviral medicine. And that combination actually has been shown to be pretty effective if started early. So in other words, remdesivir is for the virus, the dexamethasone is for the response to the virus. So we can't, as Oren's alluding to, we can't necessarily extrapolate that to this population. In other words, okay, so we've suppressed your inflammatory response, so therefore you're going to get less severe of a virus. We can't say that. However, I will say that from a bone marrow transplant perspective, there are a lot of drugs that we've used in bone marrow transplant settings, what are called immunosuppressants, like tocilizumab, for example, that we're now applying to this clinical setting of severe COVID-19 because of the body's response to the virus. Will we use that for every severe patient? Not necessarily, but we're learning a lot from what we give as immunosuppression in the bone marrow transplant setting or the cancer setting and applying it in the severe COVID-19 setting. Warren?
Yeah, I think it bears thinking about how much this twists the mind. We're talking about the body's response to the virus is actually the potentially the deadly part, where we can get you through the acute respiratory viral infection, and then there's a second body response, immune response to the virus that kind of goes out of control. Steroids are kind of a broad way of controlling that inflammatory response, and so therefore have been tried, and successfully so, to help people with severe COVID disease. The experience here in Colorado has also been our immunosuppressed patients. Generally speaking, I'm not talking about Duchenne, I'm talking about all other kinds of immune suppression, have not had severe COVID in the vast majority of cases. And we think that's because their immune system doesn't respond in the way that it usually would, meaning it's not as vigorously responsive to COVID. And so there may actually be, I hate to say it, but perhaps a positive to being a bit immunosuppressed in this scenario. The question still remains, what happens with a latent or kind of smoldering infection? We don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, there's a lot of unknowns I think we're all dealing with. I want to shift gears, given the time, and talk a bit about clinical trials. Dr. Donovan, you are in the midst of a clinical trial yourself for catabasis, during COVID. I'd love to hear about your general experience in terms of how you've been able to alter things or had to alter things because of COVID. And then you're also part of our drug development roundtable, and you've heard from other companies about what they're going through. So if you could sort of comment on both of these, your personal experience and then a bit on what you're seeing in the field.
Thank you. COVID-19 has certainly had a major impact on clinical trials in Duchenne. The priority, I think, across the board is safety of the boys, the families, the site personnel, and everybody involved. But the second priority is also to make sure that the trial integrity remains intact. And we know that families, investigators, and companies have put a huge amount of effort over the last years to bring drugs forward, many of which you'll certainly hear about later. And we don't want to lose that information. So the key has been flexibility. It's involved doing things differently. We are using, just like in the clinic, we're using much more telemedicine to monitor safety. And also, we and others are also using it to look at functional measures in boys, to be able to work with physical therapists and assess boys remotely. And the FDA has issued a guidance to allow more flexibility in clinical trials on things like shipping drugs, things that they wouldn't have been flexible about before. So that helps certainly to keep things intact. And it has had, in talking with folks at the Drug Discovery Roundtable, it's had a variable impact. I think the studies that are fully enrolled have been least affected. The studies that we're enrolling have had a major impact, and it's been hard to get studies started. But we are seeing that studies are starting up again. Different parts of the country certainly differently. But we are seeing this, and again, trying to be flexible and to make the common goal of keeping everybody safe and getting as much information from these clinical trials as we can.
Yeah, rethinking about the future of clinical trials as well, on how we might have to do things differently. Yeah. Eric, do you want to?
Yeah, actually, Dr. Donovan, so as Dr. Arletta kind of alluded to, this living with COVID might be lasting for a while. Do you expect how clinical trials are designed and run to be changed in response to COVID, and not just during the time of the pandemic, but kind of changing how we design them, from now on, to be more prepared for these kind of disruptions?
Mhm. Absolutely. And I think it mirrors what we're seeing in the rest of medicine, that telemedicine has made 10 years of progress in the last few months, that people are comfortable with telemedicine. And many of the companies are working to figure out ways that we can we've tried to minimize the burden on families, minimize the visits, but be able to still get information remotely. And that, I think that as new trials start, you're going to see a lot more of that, to be able to realize basically that we are doing trials in the age of COVID, and we're going to need to be more flexible, and we're going to need to be able to get the information remotely to answer these questions. Mm-hmm. So I think it is a good thing that to advance clinical trials, and it's making companies and FDA move much faster, I think, than we would have otherwise.
Yeah, I agree. Pat, on that topic of moving to new ways of clinical trials, I mean, what are your thoughts on where we're headed in light of COVID?
Well, I'm hopeful, exactly as Joanne was talking about. I think that we're in an era where a platform design study might be very useful, especially to look at these downstream products, where we could be very inclusive of everyone in the population and get to yes or no more easily, use some creative designs, the testing at home in terms of video capture and et cetera. I think we have to do things in a much, much different way. I also have a question for the group about if we close our eyes and go fast forward to the time when a vaccine is available, perhaps several. I know Pfizer and Gilead are using mRNA, and I understand that the UK group is looking at a viral-delivered vaccine. So as a parent of a child with Duchenne or a young man with Duchenne, how should I think about this? We want our children vaccinated. We talked about attenuated viruses versus live virus, and how can we protect them more specifically in the face of the long-term steroid use. So what is this? Would you expect that this vaccine is going to be completely safe for these young men in terms of those on steroids? That they should grab at it for an mRNA or think about one versus another? How would you think of a vaccine if and when the day comes when that's available?
I think that's a great question, and not to hedge, but we don't know, right? I mean, they just started with the vaccines, but I will say that as Joanna has alluded to, the gas pedal is down. Let's continue with the process of making sure that we streamline and get these things done, as long as it's safe, right? No one's going to jeopardize safety for just getting it out there. But with regards to efficacy, Pat, that you're alluding to in special populations, part of that is being able to kind of test the vaccine in those populations. Usually, conventionally, the vaccines are given to healthy people, right? And then they look at their immune response, and then they see what the immune response is. But certainly, those patients who are immunocompromised would seem to benefit the most. But they have to be properly tested. I will say all the vaccines that you mentioned, with regards to the ones that are currently in the pipeline, are inactivated. So the chance of getting the virus from an inactivated vaccine is pretty low, much like all the vast majority of the influenza vaccines are inactivated. So as long as they're inactivated, it should be a low risk. Then it becomes efficacy. In other words, if you're on steroids, is it going to blunt your B cell response in order to make antibodies? And I think we're going to have to just test it out. In other words, not so much in Duchenne's as a test out, but in other populations that are on steroids, other immunosuppressants, and then looking at their antibody responses to the vaccine.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
I'll also add that much like influenza vaccine, sometimes just making a disease less severe is a really good thing. So if we look at influenza, the vast majority of patients who are hospitalized or die from influenza are those who are not vaccinated. So there's plenty of good data that receiving a vaccine may minimize the severity of the disease. And then we can also rely on herd immunity. So everyone around us has also been vaccinated for COVID-19. So the transmission rates are much lower. Plus you have some immune response, even if you're on steroids. All those things add up to much more protection than what we have now.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to the panel. I think this has been, we could talk about this for hours, but in truth, this is going to touch nearly every discussion that happens over the course of the next 4 days. This is going to come up over and over again, and we're going to be doing future webinars on specific topics related to school in the coming weeks, so we hope you'll join us for that. So thank you all. We really appreciate your time. Okay, so we're going to take a 5-minute break. When we come back, we're going to do our first set of polling. You'll find the polling link on the bottom of your player. It's pollev.com/PPMD. You can open that in a new browser on your mobile device. We have some fun prizes at the end of the day. So polling is for our families. So we hope you'll join us, and we'll see you in 5 minutes.
PPMD has developed a number of tools to help you and your family explore the clinical trial landscape in Duchenne. Our interactive drug development pipeline, under our research banner, is a resource for learning about different approved and investigational products. These approved and investigational products are grouped by therapeutic area, and we track where the products are in development. Simply click on a product to learn more about how it functions, its current status, any associated trials, and to access PPMD's video library for that product. To learn more about trials you may be eligible for, please visit our trial finder under our research banner. Trials are grouped by recruitment stage and can be sorted by various inclusion criteria. The trial finder can also provide more information on the other studies in the clinical trial landscape. To learn more, please visit nduchenne.org/pipeline.
Welcome back. We're going to do some polling and a pop quiz before we start the next session. You'll see on your agenda throughout the next couple of days, you'll see pop quiz. We're going to be instituting polling and a pop quiz for our families. This is for Duchenne families only. You'll be able to participate in the polling by visiting the link that's below the player or opening up a new page on your browser or through your mobile device to pollev.com/PPMD. So we're going to ask you a series of questions that you can begin answering when you see that first question appear on your screen. And it's as simple as just clicking the response. And we can get a sense of some of the questions we wanted to ask for the community. This one's around the background of the participants who are on the line. The majority being males with Duchenne. We have some males with Becker, followed by a female with Duchenne or Becker.
Which I think is what we normally expect, but it is good to see that we have some families with Becker and some carriers, and we definitely have some sessions that we're going to be discussing some of those different diagnoses.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I think we can move on to the next question. So we want to know the age of the person affected. If you have more than one child affected, you can choose multiple brackets, or if they're in the same bracket, just choose that bracket. We're seeing a mix of age groups so far coming in. And a nice spread of different age groups that are represented in the audience. Again, we're going to do these polling questions throughout the conference and finish with a pop quiz, which will have prizes associated with it. So we make you do a little work, and then we have a fun question. Try to, shake it up a little bit. So we see various responses here, the most being 15 to 18 as these are coming through. We've got higher percentage in 6 to 8 and 12 to 14. So it really is a nice spread of different age groups.
That's good too. We got within that 15 to those young adults as well. Just a reminder again, we're going to have that Zoom social for everyone to connect.
Yeah. And for those newly diagnosed families, we have those resources online for you. Okay, I think we can move to the next question. Okay, so we want to know, given what we just heard about with COVID-19 and all that's happening, we want to know what describes your family and how you're managing life around COVID-19. You can choose 3 that apply here.
Yeah, and we do recognize too that some of this is going to be dependent probably on where you live in the U.S. and what kind of rules may be in place already in your states, and some of this is going to be personal practice as well. But no judgment here for what you and your family are practicing, even though we had a screen name, we're just using that as part of the prize question.
Yes, we make none of that public. It is important that you enter a screen name in if you were asked. Please make it your name that you registered with, because that's the only way we're going to be able to tell if you won the prize. We'll be able to reach out to you when we do that pop quiz question.
Do you see a lot of mask wearing, a lot of social distancing, and then in those cases where maybe meeting with some other family members or friends, still practicing some of those good practices that Dr. Aletta shared with us, which is great to see.
And I think it's important to recognize that it doesn't mean 33% of only our people are doing that. Can you explain that to the audience?
So,
because it's 3.
Right, because you're entering it as one of your 3 kind of answers. It does end up kind of pulling that percentage down. So we'll have the numbers for this afterwards that we'll be able to kind of share with the community.
But you could see the 3 most popular answers. Okay, let's move on to the next question. So in light of the pandemic, how worried are you about going back to school in person this fall? And we did put in an option for those who have already decided what they're doing, if they're doing it by home, correct?
Right. Which, some families are opting to do. Again, this is probably going to differ between whether, if you have a child that's in the elementary school range and you're doing what you're school decides, or some of those young men that we had that are of the college age and might be considering going back to their local college or university. It's definitely going to have an impact as well. We are seeing, a lot of folks that are actually transitioning to, online this year, which may be by choice. Again, maybe their school district making that decision.
And still a high percentage that are either very or extremely worried, which is understandable. Okay, we're going to move to the next, and this is the pop quiz question. This is the one that has a prize associated with it. Pop quiz: what country consumes the most chocolate? Give everyone a bit to answer this, and then I'll tell you what the answer is. And the first person who answered this correctly and put in their screen name, we will reveal a prize at the end of this day one. And at the end of every day, we'll reveal the prize winner for who answered it correctly first.
So you'll find it interesting. Nobody thinks Spain.
Yeah, apparently Spain doesn't like chocolate. Now, if you Googled it, you probably didn't win the prize, because we need the first person who answered will be the one who won the prize. But see, someone is voting for Spain. Okay. In the interest of time, so the answer to this question, this pop quiz, is actually Switzerland. Good Swiss chocolate, which I think everyone can understand is great chocolate. So we'll reveal the winner at the end. But thank you for polling, and we'll be polling throughout the conference. Okay. So next up on our agenda, we're going to begin an exploration into the Duchenne research panels. And this is our series called In the Pipeline. This first In the Pipeline discussion is reducing inflammation. So we're going to hear from companies that are focused on developing therapies aimed at reducing inflammation. And Eric, perhaps you can explain a bit about, Eric Camino, about this mechanism of reducing inflammation and what these drugs are meant to do.
Yeah, so I think we're all very aware of the fact that inflammation is a big challenge within this disease. When we think about the root cause of this disease being a mutation in the DMD gene and that causing a lack of production of dystrophin, that ultimately contributes to these weaker muscle membranes. And so what happens, we have contents from the cell that escape and are seen as damage signals. And so your immune system is going to respond to that. It's going to create this and promote a pro-inflammatory state. And within those who have Duchenne, we kind of end up in this state of chronic inflammation. And this has negative impacts on a lot of the parts of the body and can even contribute to some of the muscle damage we see. So because of that, there are different strategies that we have to try to tackle this problem of inflammation. So we can try to, modulate the immune response or target pathways that are involved in that inflammatory response. So we're going to hear about a couple of different investigational products that are looking to reduce inflammation, as well as one of the approved products that we have in Duchenne. And so today, we are going to be joined by Dr. Eric Hoffman, who is the VP of Research at Reverigen. We're going to be joined as well by Dr. Joanne Donovan. She is the Chief Medical Officer at Catabasis Pharmaceuticals. We also have Dr. Brian Pfister, who's the Executive Director and the U.S. Medical Head of Neurology at PTC Therapeutics. And we will have Dr. Gil Price, who is the Chief Medical Officer at Antisense Therapeutics. And so, as a reminder to everyone watching, if you have any questions while the presenters are going through their 6-minute presentations, please put them into the comment box below and indicate which sponsor you're directing that question towards, and we will address those when we get to the Q&A session. So we're going to go ahead and begin with Dr. Hoffman, who's going to tell us a little bit about vamorolone. Dr. Hoffman?
Hi, thanks. Pleasure to be here and speak with you. So I'm here representing Reverigen, and the drug we're developing is called vamorolone. It used to be called BBP-15, and it's meant to replace corticosteroids. So in doing that, it also targets the glucocorticoid receptor, which is the main target of deflazacort prednisone. But it also targets the mineralocorticoid receptor, which is similar to another drug already used in Duchenne for heart failure called a plerinone. There's also a membrane stabilizer. So it has multiple mechanisms of action, some of which are shared with corticosteroids and some which are quite different. And in the left there, it shows just the X-ray crystal structure of it interacting with the receptor. So we know exactly the differences, for example, between prednisone, vamorolone, and deflazacort. Next slide, please. So DMD is the initial indication. Corticosteroids are among the most prescribed drugs worldwide. It's one of the top 3 drugs, I believe, prescribed for everything from asthma, inhalers, to all sorts of things. Duchenne, so vamorolone might be used in many disorders, but Duchenne is the first disorder we've gone forward with, and we have connection with many foundations, including Parent Project, in developing this. It's orphan, we have expedited development. It's driven by an international team of DMD academic leaders. We used an established clinical trial network called Synergy. How do we make that bigger? And the goal with all of these is to then take what's good with corticosteroids, which is the benefits that you see on the sort of left side of the scale, and keep those or improve them, while there's a number of safety concerns. Can you go back to the last slide? Number of safety concerns on the right, including bone fragility, mood changes, weight gain, and would like to reduce those. Next slide. So here's some, we had 48 kids finish 2.5 years of treatment with vamorolone, which was the first Duchenne trials. And up in the upper right, you see, for example, stunting of growth. So with vamorolone, we see normal growth patterns with Duchenne children, even after 2.5 years or more of treatment, where with deflazacort or prednisone, there's stunting of growth. So it keeps the kids from growing normally. So that's one safety concern that we seem to have avoided. In the lower left is comparison of some physician-reported safety concerns, such as cushingoid, which is the bloated appearance, hirsutism, which is extra growth of hair, behavior changes. And you can see with all these, the physicians report a higher frequency of these with deflazacort and prednisone in 2 published studies compared to vamorolone. So vamorolone seems to be a quite safe drug. And again, we've had 48 boys now all have finished 2.5 years, and many are 3.5 years or more now. And we've had 0 serious adverse events due to vamorolone. Next slide. But more important is potential benefit. So do we see efficacy, and is that similar to, or better or worse than corticosteroids? So one way to look at this is time to stand. So time to stand from the floor is one of the first skills or abilities that's lost with age in Duchenne. And on the upper right, we see the line in the middle is 5 seconds. So the kids that are faster than 5 seconds generally are stable or actually will improve with age, and that's known through Synergy studies, Craig McDonald, and other large studies. Whereas if you're slower, if the boy is slower than 5 seconds, they're likely to decline in the future. And so when these boys entered the vamorolone trials at 4 to 7 years of age, many of them were slower than 5 seconds, and some were faster. Then after 1.5 years of treatment, you see almost all the kids became faster than 5 years. So this did much more than stabilize the disease. All the kids seemed to, or most of the kids improved even after 1.5 years of treatment. So it seems to be roughly the same benefit. We were doing a direct head-to-head comparison in the current trial, the prednisone. And we've had high satisfaction of physicians and families, and most of those 48 kids have gone on to expanded use and expanded access and compassionate use. Next slide, please. So in terms of regulatory, we're currently fully enrolled in a phase 3 or phase 2B, it's called, but it's our registration study. Readout should be in February 2021 after 6 months of treatment. The target age to date has been 4 to 7 year old steroid naive Duchenne boys, but we have started funding for and plan to kick off a broad age range from 2 to 4 years old and 7 to 18 years old. The older kids can also be previously treated with corticosteroids and transition to vamorolone. Our primary endpoint is improvement in time to stand from the floor, and we expect to have FDA submission late next year and EMA about 6 months after that. As I mentioned, this high family physician satisfaction with vamorolone. 94% of kids, the 68 kids that have come off trials to date, have all asked to stay on vamorolone, their families and physicians, rather than transition to standard of care, which is deflazacort or prednisone. Next slide. And we'd like to thank all the foundations that made this possible. We've partnered with about 15 different foundations internationally, including Parent Project, who's been instrumental in supporting these studies. Thank you. Back to you, Ryan.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Hoffman. I'm going to ask you one follow-up question before we move on to the next speaker. In regards to broadening that age group, which we think is great, will patients just need to wash out of, if they're on steroids currently, of their current steroid regimen to join that type of study?
That's a great question. And I can tell you that's elicited enormous amounts of debate within the study team, including bringing in endocrinology consultants from around the world. And, there is no consensus on that. The whole weaning of steroids has very little scientific medical evidence behind it. It's more common practice than it is established evidence-based medicine. So as the trial's currently designed, we're going to go day to day. One day, the last day of prednisone or deflazacort to the next day of vamorolone. In part because vamorolone should replace some aspects of the concerns regarding stopping glucocorticoids quickly. Mm-hmm. So I think, for example, adrenal crisis, perhaps vamorolone will protect against that.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I'm sure others will have questions during the open Q&A. We're going to move on to our next speaker, Dr. Joanne Donovan, who's going to talk about etosalenexant. Dr. Donovan?
Hello, everybody. My name is Joanne Donovan. I'm the Chief Medical Officer at Catabasis. Thank you to PPMD for the opportunity to share information today about etosalenexant and our approach to developing a treatment for Duchenne. Next slide. Catabasis is a publicly traded company, and during this presentation, I'll be talking about things that may happen in the future. Next slide. Etosalenexant is an oral drug in development for potentially everybody affected by Duchenne, regardless of mutation type. It's an NF-kappa B inhibitor, and it's not a steroid. We have data supporting etosalenexant for treatment alone, and we also believe that etosalenexant could potentially be used with other treatments, such as exon skipping and gene therapies. We've seen that etosalenexant preserved muscle function and substantially slowed disease progression while being very well tolerated in the phase 2 MOVE-DMD trial. And we're currently studying etosalenexant in our ongoing phase 3 Polaris DMD trial and the Galaxy DMD open label extension trial. Etosalenexant is an investigational agent, not currently approved in any territory. Next slide. Etosalenexant inhibits NF-kappa B, and we designed it that way because of the potential for broad therapeutic benefit in Duchenne. When boys with Duchenne are born, they lack dystrophin. However, it often takes a couple of years before symptoms are noticed. What happens in this time period? It's the absence of dystrophin and mechanical stress in the muscles that leads to chronic NF-kappa B activation, leading to inflammation and fibrosis and creating a cycle of damage. So our intention by inhibiting NF-kappa B with etosalenexant is the goal of improving skeletal muscle function, preserving cardiac muscle function, and also improving bone health with a decreased risk of fractures. Next slide, our fully enrolled phase 3 trial, Polaris DMD, is a 12-month trial with etosalenexant for boys with Duchenne aged 4 to 7 up to their 8th birthday. Now, Polaris DMD is a placebo-controlled study as needed for the FDA, with 2 boys receiving etosalenexant from the beginning for each boy that receives placebo. After 12 months, all the boys have the option to receive etosalenexant in the open-label extension study, Galaxy DMD, along with their eligible siblings. We enrolled boys that have not been on steroids for at least 6 months, as there is the potential for partial overlap in mechanism between etasolonexant and steroids. We expect to have results from this phase 3 trial in the fourth quarter of this year. Pending positive results, we then plan to file these results with the FDA in 2021. I also want to mention Galaxy DMD, the open label extension study, which means that everyone participating in Polaris DMD at that point would receive etasolonexant. We had heard from families that had sons who participated in the phase 2 study, Move DMD, that they have other sons affected by Duchenne and wanted them to receive etasolonexant, therefore enrolling eligible siblings into Galaxy DMD. Once boys complete Polaris and continue on into Galaxy, the eligible siblings will have the opportunity to enroll then. The primary focus of Galaxy DMD is to continue to evaluate long-term safety in boys. Due to the excellent safety profile of etasolonexant that we've seen to date, site visits in this study are every 6 months. On the next slide, we'll briefly review past results we've seen in the phase 2 Move DMD trial, which enrolled 31 boys aged 4 to 7 to their 8th birthday, not on steroids. The phase 2 Move DMD trial had a built-in internal control where we assessed boys off treatment and then on etasolonexant. Before they started on etasolonexant, they were declining, and on etasolonexant, the largely flat green horizontal line shows that boys had preserved muscle function and stabilized their disease progression through 72 weeks on etasolonexant compared to the off-treatment control period for the North Star ambulatory assessment. We also saw similar stabilization with etasolonexant treatment for the 3 times function tests, the 10-meter walk-run, 4-stair climb, and time to stand. On the next slide, in more than 150 years of cumulative patient exposure, we've seen that etasolonexant was well tolerated. The majority of adverse events were mild in nature. The most common treatment-related adverse event was diarrhea, generally mild and transient. We saw no SAEs, serious adverse events, on treatment. We are also pleased to see that boys on etasolonexant grew like their unaffected peers, gaining height over 72 weeks and a small amount of age-appropriate weight. As etasolonexant is not a steroid, we haven't seen and don't expect to see steroid-associated side effects. On the next slide, to close, I'd also like to mention that we announced a partnership with Duchenne UK to study etasolonexant in boys and young men that are non-ambulatory. We'll share more information about this potential phase 2 study in the coming months. I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to share this information with you. And for those of you who are interested in seeing updates along the way, we share frequent updates on social media, and you can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Dr. Donovan. I do have one follow-up question before we move on to that next speaker. You had mentioned etasolonexant in combination with exon skipping. You know, we now have 2 approved exon skipping drugs, one of which I assume may have been in patients when they went to actually recruit for your trial. Do you have patients on Exondys involved in your trial, and are you looking at an arm of those patients with that combination to see if there's a specific effect?
Yeah, that's important because we think the future is combination therapy, that lots of boys would be on that. So actually, in all 3 of our clinical trials, we have boys that are on combination with exon skipping therapy. When Exondys was approved, we amended the protocol to allow boys to start, and boys in the phase 3 trial were randomized based on whether or not they were on Exondys. With the advent of additional therapies in the extension study, we're also allowing boys to start on golodirsen or other drugs as they may become available. That's
great. Thank you so much. We so appreciate it. Okay, we're going to move on to the next speaker on our panel. This is Dr. Brian Pfister with PTC, who's going to talk about Emflaza, which is the only approved drug of those on the panel. Brian?
Great, thank you. I appreciate it. As always, it's a pleasure to be here. I love working with PPMD, and we've been working for a while, so definitely appreciate it. So when you look at what we're doing, we're trying to understand, the history that PTC has within Duchenne is incredibly long, and it gives us an advantage with regard to understanding what's happening with these boys. On the next slide, as like other companies, we are publicly traded, so here's our forward-looking statement. So on the next slide, we'll kind of get into the meat of what we're talking about. So when we look at this, and as had been mentioned earlier, so if we look at what's happening with regard to the role of inflammation in Duchenne, as was mentioned, we have this dystrophin deficient muscle, which has this leaky membrane. So it's leaking this material out that the immune system sees as damage, sees as an issue, and this kicks off the inflammatory cascade. So once the immune system recognizes this signals cytokines to produce downstream effects in this inflammation that was talked about earlier during the intro, signals T cells and B cells both in a way that creates this constant inflammatory state. So we're able to identify targets within this space. It's a very target-rich environment. We're able to identify targets within this space as therapeutic opportunities. So what we've seen within steroids, they work very well because they hit multiple different targets. So on the next slide. When we look at this, when we look at the T cell in particular, so this is important because as we mentioned before, when the leaky membrane is presenting this muscle tissue or presenting this muscle as an antigen, it does trigger an immune response. So when we look at prednisone, we look at deflazacort, we look at these kids who have this immune response, we do see a differential effect between these two treatments. When we look at this, we see that the deflazacort kids tend to have a less reactive immune system to dystrophin as an antigen. What this means is it may suggest in some way, shape, or form that we're actually controlling inflammation differently. So as you know, Emflaza, like Ryan said, is the only approved product that we're talking about today, approved for ages 2 and older. It's the only approved corticosteroid on the market, I should say. So when we look at this and we understand interrupting things like interferon gamma, which is this T cell response, has a downstream effect. So on the next slide, we can see exactly what that effect does. So by sitting on the interferon gamma receptor and changing the way that the interferon gamma is signaling, we hit multiple pathways in the inflammasome. So newer therapies, newer treatments may only target one particular side of the pathway, leaving the other side of the inflammatory pathway open to continue to create inflammation. So this suggests that there may be issues with regard to the long-term effectiveness of some of the newer treatments. So if we look at the next slide, when we have a long history of treating with steroids. And so we're able to see what the side effects are. We're able to understand those. We're able to understand too, even though if we're modulating the immune system differently, we're not seeing this increased risk of infections. We're not seeing an increased risk to the patients in general. So the benefits clearly then outweigh some of the side effects that we're seeing. So the common ones that we do see are obviously weight gain, behavioral changes, and we do see differences between deflazacort and prednisone in these areas. So this tells us, again, there's always going to be side effects. If you're not seeing side effects, there's always the question as to whether or not your drug is working. And what's important to look at here too is when you're comparing steroids, when you're comparing drugs, you have to compare them within your study, because there's age differences. So for example, deflazacort's been studied in much older children than some of the newer products. So if you look at the side effect profile, you have to keep that in mind, that patient populations are different, inclusion criteria are different. So on the next slide, when we get into what the benefit is and looking at the long-term benefit, I think this is really where it's important, because endpoints are really, again, what we're studying during the course of a trial, endpoints have to be looked at in long periods of time. So if you think about this in a decade-long study, we can actually see this benefit and we can see this impact of treatment to these kids. So for example, we talk a lot about loss of ambulation. And if you look at this, if you looked at where the 50% mark is for prednisone at the age which half of the kids in this particular trial lost ambulation, if you correlate that then to where deflazacort is, you have 50% lose ambulation about 3.5 at that, or at 13.5 at that same age, at that same point in time, you have about 85% of the deflazacort kids still walking. So this is a very meaningful endpoint. And this is very important to look at, because if you look at the age ranges within this graph, you see that kids don't begin to decline until after 8 or 9 years old. So studying it very early, you may not see the same decline in a long period of time. And what's even more important, I think, when you look at this, is to look at the scoliosis onset. So things that are tied into muscle function in a long-term benefit, like scoliosis, I think is something that deflazacort has this advantage of, a very meaningful endpoint to a lot of families. So on the next slide. When you look at this too, and I want to highlight pulmonary function, because again, this is an incredibly meaningful endpoint, because when kids can't breathe, they can't live. So if we look at this and we understand that deflazacort has a difference from prednisone with regard to functionality of lung tissue, this is really, really important. And I think that what you won't see in the newer studies and the newer drugs being developed is you're not going to see this benefit, because it does take a while to see this. It takes, again, over a decade and a lot of times to see this. So I think these are important points that we can't overlook in drug development. And I think it's something that we just need to keep in mind in general. Pardon me, getting choked up about it. So on the next slide, if you look, again, kind of in closing, we have learned a lot about steroids. We've learned a lot about deflazacort. And what we've seen is deflazacort consistently is better than prednisone. So when deflazacort's not being used in new clinical trials as an active reference or comparator, I think we're missing the boat. I think as a community, we need to come up with better treatments that are moving the bar forward, not just looking at it compared to prednisone. So thank you for your time.
Great. Thank you, Brian. Just one quick follow-up. In terms of now tracking patients who are on the approved therapies, are you all, do you have a registry that you're looking long-term with patients on Emflaza? We know that insurers require paperwork, et cetera, but is there a national sort of registry across the patient population on Emflaza?
So for Emflaza, we don't have a registry that we're working on. We do work very closely in the medical community. So, as I've mentioned before, working with you guys so closely, it feels like we know the patients by name. Yeah. So in working in the field, we have that same relationship with a lot of clinicians. So we don't have a registry, but we're well aware of the activities in the field.
Wonderful. Yeah, and that includes, we working with us with our registry, we're able to track patients on your therapy. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for collaboration. Okay, we're going to move on to the next speaker. Thank you, Brian, so much. Our last speaker of the panel is Dr. Gil Price, Chief Medical Officer with Antisense Therapeutics. Dr. Price.
Thank you very much for having me. And thank you, Pat and PPMD. We're grateful that you allow us this time. It's also good to be on any panel with my old friend, Eric Kaufman. Let me tell you just a little bit about Antisense. Antisense is a small but publicly traded company in Australia. Our lead candidate, and by the way, we're focused on rare disease and in particular Duchenne. Our lead candidate in this area is ATL-1102. It is a drug that is designed to inhibit CD49. CD49, I will tell you a little bit about in a moment. But first, let me tell you about the study that we've recently completed, or just a wee bit about the study completed. It is a study in non-ambulant boys, 12 to 18 years of age, with the median age of 14. Before we get into other details of the results of that study, again, let me just share with you a little bit about the drug. ATL-1102 is a 2-mo-gapmer antisense oligonucleotide. It's designed, again, to inhibit CD49 expression on lymphocytes. Interestingly, DMD patients have greater numbers of circulating T cells with high levels of CD49 expression. And that sort of gets to the mechanism of action that we believe that we can allow our patients to benefit from. Also, interestingly, we don't believe that corticosteroids appear to have any effect on CD49 T cell numbers. So again, we think that that's something that gives us a bit of an advantage. Next slide. So just getting to the results of our phase 2 study, we were able to meet our primary endpoints and had strong effect on our secondary endpoints, activity on our disease progression markers. We had improvement and stabilization across different measures of motor function and strength via performance of upper limb tests and pinch strength and distal mobility. Our activity on the targeted CD49 cells was consistent with what we believe is the drug's mechanism of action. And now we've just recently had new MRI data that suggests stabilization of the percent of fat in muscle, which we believe is very important. We're happy to say that we have support from key international opinion leaders, which takes me to the next slide. Our next slide are just the key takeaways. Thank you. The key takeaways that I would leave you with. As the last presenter, I'm trying to get off as quickly as possible to allow you to move on. So the key takeaways would be this. Our phase 2 study has shown that ATL 1102 is a treatment that resulted in consistent improvements or stabilization across a number of different measures. We have support from the DMD community, and right now, not surprisingly, we're looking into our strategies for moving forward in a global way. What can we do from a regulatory study design perspective? And those discussions are going on internally, and they take a lot of our time and energy, but we know that it's worthwhile. We want to get ourselves to the best place possible to help our boys live longer and better lives. So Ryan, I'll leave it with that and send it back to you.
Wonderful. A quick follow-up on this. I'm sure that you've been asked this before and everyone's asking it. Timing for coming to the U.S. Is there a rough estimate or do you have a sense of when you will be planning studies? Right.
So again, we're a small company in Australia. Represent, along with Aaron Cox and two of our board members. The four of us represent our presence in the U.S. currently. But we believe that we may be small, but we're strong and well-intended. So we're encouraging our senior management in Australia to think about coming to the U.S. more quickly than they may have ever thought. So I can't give you an exact date for that, but we are eager. We believe that we have good support here, and we intend to be here sooner rather than later.
Wonderful. We like eager, and we appreciate that you're in the space, so we will be keeping in touch with you. Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Price. We are now going to move on to the Q&A panel. Lots of questions have come in since you all started speaking, and Eric's going to lead that Q&A. Eric?
Yes, and so please remember, if you do have questions, submit them to that box below, and we will try to get to them. Those that we can't, we will pass on to the sponsors. But to begin, so we've got a lot of questions running on similar themes, and so I'm going to start with one that has been coming through a lot, which with the investigational products in the relationship to steroids. Can you just clarify, do you anticipate this being taken in place of steroids, which we know are standard of care, or in combination with steroids? And so Dr. Hoffman, I'll start with you.
Yeah, it would be one or the other. It would not be both at the same time.
Dr. Donovan?
We see this as a foundational therapy that other drugs like exon skipping can be built on, but the foundation.
Okay. And Dr. Price?
So similar to that, we would see this as a foundation that other drugs can be added to. And as I sort of tried to highlight, we don't believe that steroids have any effect on CD49. So while we may have that profound effect on CD49, steroids may be accretive to that on the other side.
Okay, great. We also have a lot of questions coming in about how these products may interact or be used alongside gene therapy. So we do know that steroids are still currently used early on in the process, and those boys tend to still be on them. So can go around to all of our presenters, and actually, Dr. Pfister, I'll start with you on how deflazacort may be used with gene therapy.
No, I think this is a great question, because when you look at it and you go back to, again, Eric, what you had mentioned about the dystrophin being present within the leaky muscle tissue. So when I replace dystrophin or mini dystrophin, I actually still have to control for that immune response. So this is going to be absolutely critical to this. And when you look at the life cycle of T cells, they regenerate every day. So when you look at even the idea of daily dosing of steroids to protect that newly produced dystrophin that you have via the immune or via the gene therapy is critical to the long-term success and functionality. Also, switching that M1, M2 to be regenerative is going to be critical to that piece. So I see it as still a cornerstone.
Great, thank you. Dr. Price?
So it's a little bit early in the discussion for us to be thinking about that. But again, I can see a path forward. So I'll just leave it at that for the moment, considering where we are.
Okay, great. Dr. Donovan?
Yes, so in gene therapy, there's two different ways that steroids are used. And they're used initially to suppress the immune response to the virus itself. That's high dose, and any gene therapy, that is the case, that there are several months where the boys are, or whoever is on high dose steroids. Then long term, do you need steroids is the question, because with other gene therapies, you're able to taper off at that point. And because the goal of gene therapy is to convert what looks like Duchenne to something more like Becker, there still is believed that there will be inflammation there. So ideally, you would have something long term in the case of Duchenne to maintain and to continue to suppress inflammation. So we think that there's kind of two different questions. What do you use short term, and what would you use long term? And we think that for long term, that has great potential for etaselenexant.
Great. And Dr. Hoffman, on that note, do you think, in addition to maybe the long term, that there's a possibility for vamorolone to be used in that early kind of immunosuppressant phase? Did have a question about that as well.
It's possible, but yeah, I think that early immune suppression stage in gene therapy is extremely important, and where kids run into trouble too, side effects that hospitalize them. Not just in Duchenne, but in many disorders. So everybody's trying to tweak that immune reaction with multiple drugs, but even besides steroids. But I agree with Joanne that our place is certainly in the would be used. Vamorolone would be used in combination with gene therapy long term. The acute is much trickier, as Joanne said.
Thank you. And actually, we have another set of questions coming on, and Dr. Donovan, I think you kind of hit on this already, just in general about possibility for these drugs to be tested or for the labels to be expanded to include patients that have Becker muscular dystrophy, or for those female carriers that may manifest symptoms early on with some more severe progression. So if you could all maybe share what your thoughts and plans are for those other diagnoses. And Dr. Donovan, I'll start with you.
Yes, I think that Becker is a disease that has not traditionally been treated with steroids, although some of the patients who have more severe symptoms are. And that's because of the side effect profile of steroids. So if you could suppress the inflammation, the NF-kappa B-driven inflammation, without the negative effects, that would be a very good thing. So that is something that we are thinking about. And there's actually even other forms of muscular dystrophy in which inflammation is key.
Great. Dr. Hoffman?
Yes, the National Institutes of Health is just funding a clinical trial of vamorolone in Becker muscular dystrophy out to Paula Clemens at University of Pittsburgh. Mm-hmm. Plan to start that soon. Another advantage of vamorolone in Becker is we've shown that it increases dystrophin levels in Becker models. So, and that this has to do with microRNAs and so we hope that vamorolone will show even better efficacy in Becker than it does in Duchenne.
Great, thank you. And Dr. Price, I know you said this is still very early days, but maybe you can share your thoughts.
Yeah. So keep in mind that our phase 2 study was in non-ambulant boys, which is an area that there are not too many players in. And so that, again, was a reason for encouragement after we took a look at the very positive data. What we've talked about now is not necessarily Becker's, but what we've talked about is expanding into ambulant boys as well. Following along with that, you could certainly see how we may end up down the road in that Becker's model as well. So I wouldn't put that aside, but I think our next step will be into the ambulant population.
Great, thank you. And Dr. Pfister, obviously, as Dr. Donovan indicated, we don't want to necessarily put, Becker patients on long-term use of steroids. We did have a question come in though about use of Emflaza. If you have any data looking at kind of the different dosing regimens, so whether daily dosing or weekend dosing, if you guys have been able to collect any data on that.
Yes, there's actually, there are data that do exist on that. So up in Canada, Doug Bigger had done some research on that. And so there is a study that shows that. And what you see is anytime you have a steroid, again, getting back to the T and B cell story about how this is working, anytime you're dosing a steroid in an alternate dosing fashion, you're going to not have the same effectiveness with regard to the T cell modulation. And so what we do see is in the Synergy study, you saw kids who had alternate dose prednisone. So kind of getting to that, you did see a difference in their effectiveness as compared to daily. So in what we saw within the, what Doug had published, within that space is that he had looked at alternate dosing in a different form with Emflaza or deflazacort actually in that case. And what they did see is that there was some benefit, although it's decreased. And that is consistent with what you see. And you have to look at this over the long term again, because things in the short term sometimes do look comparable. Long term, you see vast differences. So,
great, thank you. And I know, obviously, or we all know that steroids are used throughout the course of the disease. And Dr. Price and Dr. Hoffman, you both indicated your current plans for non-ambulatory. Dr. Donovan, could you maybe touch on your plans for non-ambulatory? I know there was an announcement shared, I believe it was earlier this year or maybe late last year, about plans for non-ambulatory.
Yes, Duchenne UK graciously granted us funds to initiate a study in non-ambulatory, and so we are working on plans for that right now in the non-ambulatory population. Great.
No, we love to see the expansion to make these products available to all members of our community. We had a question come in asking about collection of CK levels, and I think we can maybe expand this a little broader. Of in addition to the functional outcome measures that you are all collecting, what potential serum biomarkers are you looking at, and are there plans with any of those type of collections or anything from the placebo groups that you are running to share that data with the community? So maybe first I'll direct this one to Dr. Hoffman.
I think biomarkers are very important. Everything in biomarkers is what they call context of use. How are you using the biomarkers, and then making sure the biomarker is fit for purpose. And we've used lots of biomarkers throughout the vamorolone program in different contexts of use. Specifically with regards to CK, we see a dose-dependent decrease in CK, highly significant over 2 weeks. So, and that, even when you stop the drug, persists for another 2 weeks. So we are seeing what we think is the membrane stabilization and loss of inflammation. The CK shows that as a biomarker. Although if you look long-term, one of the problems with CK is it's extremely volatile. So, you start exercising or not exercising, it starts changing your CK. So CK is not a particularly reliable biomarker. We were actually surprised we saw such reductions. But you've seen it also impressive changes in gene therapy and other disorders. So we're using other biomarkers like inflammation biomarkers, membrane stability biomarkers, and we're using those both acutely, long-term. Our context of use is often to try to find the right dose because they become what's called objective outcome measures. You can watch them change very quickly in the blood to know that the drug's hitting its target, and that's how we use them mostly. And we make all that data public.
Great. Again, we love to see the sharing of data. Dr. Donovan?
Yes, we have looked at biomarkers like CK, and we've seen CK and other enzymes as well as biomarkers reduced statistically significantly. We've also looked at MRI, which is a really great biomarker in terms of looking at muscle, the structure of muscle. and we're able to see changes there, working with the imaging DMD group, again, seeing statistically significant improvements there. And ultimately, yes, I fully support data sharing as we move forward in the placebo group. There's a lot of great data that has come out of those data collaborations, de-risk, CTAP, and a lot of important learnings in terms of understanding the natural history when you look at data across placebo arms of many studies.
Great, thank you. Dr. Price?
Yeah, I agree with Eric and Joanne about data sharing and the value that can come from that. I also agree with Joanne. There's a lot of value in MRI data. For example, as I mentioned, we were able to see how fat was spared in muscle with our drug. That's an important piece. We're also taking a look at various biomarkers. I do agree with Eric. CK is can be a little squirrely. So we're trying to take a look at what other interleukins and cytokines that may be able to give us a little clearer picture. But yeah, we'll be doing that and making that a part of our 2B follow-up study.
Thank you. And Dr. Pfister, can you maybe share some of what PTC has done to date?
Sure, definitely. So one of the things about the Deflazacort that is nice is that we do have an understanding of the cytokine signature, right? And so the important thing within Duchenne is what it is at 5 is not what it is at 15, right? So there's this fluctuation. So it's like a fingerprint. It may be similar, but there are variations based upon what the journey of the patient is. So we've been able to isolate different cytokines, understanding the role of interferon gamma, for example, IL-10, IL-6, TGF beta. So as we get into this, understanding exactly what this looks like, we can then predict where we should be. And from this, then we can begin to spring forward and think about what other molecules could be developed based upon why we've seen such good efficacy and long-term effectiveness with Deflazacort.
Great, thank you for sharing that. And then one quick last question, I think, before we wrap this session up, given that we just had that really great discussion earlier in the day about COVID-19, I wonder if you could all maybe share something that you've adapted in your trials or, with PTC, how maybe that's impacted your decision-making process as we're kind of in this new landscape. And so actually, Dr. Pfister, I'll start with you.
Yeah, so it's definitely something we're looking at because I think everybody's been impacted with the timelines, right? So we'd love to be further ahead than we are in certain things, but what it has really signaled to us is as we develop new medications, they have to be tolerable and effective, and they can't be sensitive to change, right? So as we can't get out and see physicians, I think it becomes very important. The other thing too is it really puts focus on, with telemedicine, the ability to use upper limbs, right? So when you think about this, so you build in maybe some of these as endpoints in clinical trials, looking at is their upper limb function maintained, because as these boys grow into men, if they're 18, they can go to the doctor on their own with telemedicine. So there's this huge idea, let's think outside the box. How do we connect people to the information they need, and how do we maintain the ability to be independent? So we've looked at that, and we're really focused on what that means to the future of development.
Thank you. Dr. Price, we know that you're, early on in some of the planning stages. Has this impacted some of the trial design that you and the group at Antisense Therapeutics are considering?
Yeah, well, it certainly has. I mean, I don't know if you are aware or saw in the European Journal of Heart, they just did an observational look of just over 1,200 subjects who were COVID positive, and 55% of those people that they looked at had an impact on their heart, had cardiac changes, 55%. So it started to make us think about, gee, if that's true for heart, can it be true? Does it have implications for Duchenne? And how we take a look at our endpoints for potentially boys who have been COVID positive. Along too with what Brian is talking about, I mean, we're thinking about all those kinds of things. How can we employ telemedicine, wearables, Bluetooth thermometers, et cetera, to collect the data that we need against this backdrop of the pandemic? So yeah, it's a part of our conversation.
Great. No, those thoughts about, what can we do to make things a bit more remote and open it up, and potentially for parts of our community that don't have access to clinical trials, those are great ideas to hear. Dr. Hoffman, How has Reveragen been adapting?
Well, certainly the word that everybody seems to use is pivot. You feel like you're pivoting so much, you're dizzy. But yeah, we had to rapidly move to remote assessments, and because patients couldn't travel or weren't permitted to, research subjects weren't permitted to go to their clinical sites. So things are back in most places, but then there's dangers of them being shut again. It's also made us, it sort of changed the regulatory landscape a bit and brought a bit more leniency into it. So, what we've seen is really, do we need so many clinic visits during a trial? Because, there's not only is it burdensome to the families and also expensive, but at some point it's a risk, with COVID-19. And so that changes that set point of monitoring safety, where maybe less monitoring is more safe, and particularly remotely. And that's an interesting change. And then finally, I'd also echo the remote assessments. So Roxana Ben-Dixon at Pittsburgh is running a sub-study on our pivotal trial ongoing, where we have actigraph monitors 24/7 over a year on 2 to 4-year-olds in our trial. So we have all their sleep health, we have their activity, and then we can correlate those with what happens in the clinic and those assessments. And the goal is maybe these actigraphy devices can start replacing clinic visits.
That's a really exciting addition. I'll be looking forward to seeing that data whenever you're able to share it. And Dr. Donovan, again, thank you for participating in our earlier conversation about it. We really appreciated your insight. Is there anything you'd like to add as well?
I think that, certainly it's changed a lot of the ways that we do things and moved things ahead to use telemedicine, remote assessments. I think the very impressive thing that we have seen is we're all in this together. We have just seen the families, the sites personnel. Sometimes they're deployed to other areas. They're still managing to get stuff done. So it's really an incredible effort by the whole ecosystem to move things ahead and to make sure things continue to work. So thank you for everybody out there who has been helping on this.
Well, thank you. And thank you to all of our panel members. We really appreciate your participation today and answering those questions from the community. For those who didn't get their questions answered, we are going to be sharing those with the sponsors. And as a reminder, you can go and visit all of these companies' presentations, the little longer form, in the conference hub. So you can learn more about any one of these products. And again, feel free to submit your questions there. And we do want to say, a quick thank you to our friends at Action Duchenne, who we borrowed the 6-minute talk test from. We have a lot going on over these couple of days, and so we're trying to get a lot of information out there. And thank you as well to all of our sponsors for being willing to, put up with
you did great.
Our formats.
Very impressive. So you all kept to it.
Yeah, you guys set the bar very high.
Yes.
And I think with that, we have a few more things to tackle before we wrap up today. But
thank you to our panelists.
Yeah.
It really brings us to the end of day one in our virtual conference for day one. We want to thank all of our panelists from today. A special thanks to all you who attended virtually to join us. I do want to call out the pop quiz winner. This is our first pop quiz winner of the week. The person who got the answer done the quickest and put their full name into the screen name. You have to put your full name is Eduardo Torcellin. So we will contact you, Eduardo, with a $100 Amazon gift card. That's awesome. So everyone, please continue to do the polling. Eric's going to tell us what's ahead for tomorrow.
So we have another packed day tomorrow. So we are going to begin with the Lunch and Learn series in the afternoon, so make sure you get signed up for those. In addition to that, tomorrow night, our sessions are going to first tackle resiliency, which I know is a topic we could all use right now, talking about overcoming compassion fatigue and burnout. We're also going to have our next in the series of In the Pipeline, and we are going to be talking about strategies that look towards restoring dystrophin, so our exon skipping and stop codon read-through products. Tomorrow night is also going to be the first in our Zoom socials, and that's going to be for our teens and adults, so I'm sure we're looking forward to that. And just a reminder to check your email in the morning. We will have all of the details for what's going to take place tomorrow, for you first thing.
Great. So as we close tonight, our first night, we have a special performance by Cooper Jones from Redondo Beach, California. The Jones family is near and dear to our hearts, and we've known them for many years. We've known Cooper since he was little. Cooper's now performing and writing his own songs, learned guitar 2 years ago. Please enjoy this special performance by Cooper Jones, and we will see you tomorrow. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Cooper Jones from Redondo Beach, California, and I'm going to be playing Fake Plastic Trees by Radiohead.
Fake plastic watering can for a fake Chinese rubber band and a fake plastic girl. She bought from a rubber man and a town full of rubber plants. So get real itself. It wears her out. It wears her out. It wears her out. It wears her out. Lives with a broken man, a cracked polysiren man who just crumbles and burns. He used to do surgery for girls in their 80s. Gravity always wins. It wears him out. It wears him out. It wears him out. It wears. Looks like the real thing, tastes like the real thing, the fake plastic love. I can't help but feeling blow through the ceiling. Fake plastic girl, it wears me out. It wears me out. It wears me out. It wears me out. And if I could
Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the conference.